The smell reaches you before anything else. Not a pleasant smell. Not the kind you'd choose. It's animal and earth, and something older than either. A deep, wet, organic weight that settles into the back of your throat and stays there. This is a tannery. And if you've ever stood inside one, a real one, on a working one, you don't forget it. The floor is dark with decades of moisture. The beams overhead are stained the color of strong tea. Pits are cut into the ground, filled with liquid the color of bark and rust. And inside those pits, slowly, almost invisibly, something is happening that has been happening for at least 10,000 years. Animal hide is becoming leather. It doesn't happen fast. It doesn't happen clean. And for most of human history, it happened entirely by hand, by people who understood chemistry without ever calling it that, who controlled pH through instinct and experience, and who judged whether months of work had succeeded by pressing a thumb into the surface and knowing. Just knowing. This is the story of that process. The materials, the labor, the knowledge that lived in the body of the person doing the work, and what it took to learn it, and what it meant to carry it. A freshly slaughtered hide is not leather, it's tissue. Protein and fat and hair and membrane, layered together, soft and fragile and beginning to decay almost immediately. The tanner's first job was to stop that decay, and then to undo the hide's natural structure entirely, so something more durable could replace it. The hide arrived salted or dried to slow decomposition. The tanner soaked it in water first, rehydrating it, making it workable again. Then it went into a lime bath. Lime, calcium hydroxide, is caustic. It swells the hide fibers, breaks down the hair roots, and begins to loosen the epidermis from the dermis below. A hide might stay in lime suspension for days, sometimes weeks, depending on the season, the temperature, the thickness of the skin, the judgment of the man watching it. There were no timers, no test strips. The tanner checked by touch and by eye. He knew what the surface should feel like when the hair was ready to release. He knew what happened when you waited too long. If you grew up near a trade like this, where the knowledge lived in the hands and not in a manual, you know what that kind of learning looks like. Tell us about it in the comments. After the lime, the scraping began. The fleshing beam is a curved wooden post, chest height, worn smooth by generations of use. The tanner drapes the hide over it and works with a two-handled blade, drawing it down the surface in long, controlled strokes, removing flesh and fat from the underside, and then turning the hide and scraping away the loosened hair and epidermis from the grain side. This is not delicate work. It is heavy, repetitive, demanding. A full cattle hide weighs 30, 40, 50 pounds when wet. Controlling it on the beam while applying consistent pressure, maintaining the right angle, reading the resistance of the fiber. That requires strength and precision at the same time. New workers tore hides. Experienced tanners didn't. The difference was in how the hands learned to listen to the material. After fleshing and unhairing, the hide went through a process called delimbing, a bath of organic acids, often fermented grain or dog dung, which neutralized the alkalinity left by the lime. The chemistry mattered. Too much acid, too fast, and the fibers would break down unevenly. Too little, and the tannin wouldn't penetrate. Tanners had names for the smells. They had words for the textures at each stage. They had a vocabulary for this work that took years to build, and those words were learned from other tanners in the pit yards beside the beam. Bark tanning is where the leather becomes leather. The stripped, fleshed, delimed hide, now called a pelt, went into a series of pits, each containing a stronger concentration of tannin solution. Tannin is an astringent compound found in oak bark, hemlock bark, chestnut, quebracho, dozens of species, and each producing slightly different leather. Oak was preferred for heavy sole leather. Hemlock was common in America. The bark was ground in bark mills, mixed with water, and allowed to steep into a solution called ooze. The pelt moved through the pit slowly, weeks in weaker solutions, then months in stronger ones. A full sole leather might spend a year, sometimes more, in the tan pits before it was finished. The tannin molecules bound to the collagen proteins in the hide, linking them together, replacing the water that had kept the fibers supple with something that would not rot, would not stretch without limit, would not fail. It's a chemical transformation, a replacement of one kind of stability with another. And the tanner managed it not with instruments, but with experience, checking the depth of tannin penetration by cutting a sliver from the hide edge and reading the cross-section. When the color ran uniform all the way through, the leather was ready. Have you ever watched someone read a material the way a tanner reads a cut hide? The way a woodworker reads a grain, or a metal worker reads a heat color? There's a kind of knowledge in that act that doesn't translate to description. If you've seen it, you know what we mean. Out of the pit, the leather was still stiff, rough, and saturated. The finishing process brought it to its final character. The hide was hung to dry slowly, not in direct sun, not too fast. Uneven drying caused uneven tension. The tanner watched the moisture leave and knew when to intervene. Then came the staking, working the leather over a blunt wooden post, stretching and softening the fibers by hand, moving across the surface systematically, breaking the stiffness without breaking the structure. This took hours. For thick leather, days. Fat liquoring, working oils and greases into the surface, restored the flexibility that the tanning process had removed. Different leathers required different fats. Brain tanning, a distinct method used especially for buckskin, used the animal's own neural tissue, which contains natural emulsifiers. The knowledge of which fat, in what quantity, at what stage, was specific and hard-won. Finally, the surface was worked smooth, sometimes with a slicking stone, sometimes with glass. The grain was brought up or flattened depending on the end use. And the tanner examined the result, the color, the temper, the feel, and knew whether the months of work had produced what the months of work were supposed to produce. Most of the time, it had. Because these were not people who guessed. They were people who had learned to know. Tanning was not a respected trade in the social sense. Tanneries were placed downwind of towns. The smell was a constant companion. The work was wet and heavy and unglamorous. But within the trade, there was a clear hierarchy of skill. A master tanner knew the lime yard, the beam house, the tan pits, the finishing room. He had absorbed through years of repetition a working knowledge of organic chemistry, materials science, and quality control, without ever being taught those terms. Many tanners were the sons of tanners. The knowledge passed father to son, master to apprentice, in yards where the oldest pits had been in use for generations. There were tanneries in early America operating in the same location, with the same methods for 100 years. A young man starting in a tannery in 1840 would spend his first years on the most physical tasks, managing the heavy hides, scraping, moving, lifting. He would watch. He would ask questions when questions were welcome, and more often he would simply absorb by proximity. By the time he managed a pit yard alone, he had 5-10 years in his body. That wasn't education. That was something else. Maybe someone in your family worked a trade like this. A leather trade, a wet trade, something built on physical labor and accumulated knowledge. If that's part of your history, we'd like to hear it. In 1858, a German chemist named Friedrich Knapp published early research on chrome tanning. By the 1880s, it had been developed into a practical industrial process. Chrome tanning could produce finished leather in a day, sometimes less. It used chromium sulfate salts rather than vegetable tannins, and the resulting leather was softer, more uniform, easier to dye, easier to produce at scale. The industry shifted, not overnight, but decisively. By the early 20th century, the great bark tanneries were closing. The hemlock forests that had supplied them had already been heavily cut. The economics of the trade had changed, and the labor that had sustained it, the specific, embodied, seasonal, years-long labor, was no longer required at the same scale. Chrome tanning now produces roughly 80 to 90% of the world's leather. It is faster, cheaper, and more consistent than vegetable tanning. The leather it produces is genuinely useful and genuinely durable. That is the honest account, not a tragedy, a transition. What was lost was not leather. What was lost was a particular kind of knowledge, the kind that lived in the body, in the nose, in the calluses on a fleshing hand, and the community that had built and held and passed on that knowledge across generations. There are still vegetable tanneries operating in the United States. A small number. In New England, in the upper Midwest, yes, in a few places where the work continued through the industrial transition, because the market for high-quality sole leather and bridle leather and saddlery never fully disappeared. In Europe, particularly in France, England, and parts of Italy, vegetable tanning has maintained a continuous tradition, and some tanneries have been in operation for more than 200 years. The knowledge has not vanished, but it is concentrated now in fewer places, held by fewer people, transmitted to fewer apprentices. The beam houses still smell the same. The tannin pits still require the same patience. The hide still tells the tanner, through touch and time, when it is ready. Those who work this way know something, a specific, earned physical thing. They know it in a way that no manual captures and no video fully conveys. Do you think trades like this should still be taught? Not as history, but as living practice? It's a real question, not a simple one. We're curious where you land. Skill lives in hands, and hands do not last forever. Under this video, there's a subscribe button. It's a small action, but it helps keep stories like this alive. If craftsmanship still matters to you, if you believe skill deserves to be remembered, subscribing simply means you want these trades documented while they're still here. And before you go, tell us where you're watching from. Is there still a blacksmith in your town? A shoe repair shop? A workshop that smells like oil and wood? Have you lived this life or watched it fade? Share your story in the comments. That's how these trades stay visible.